Ukrainian jet STRIK Russian dam pluts, and a 17-meter blast erased a supply lifeline in under 4 seconds.
This is CNN Breaking News.
At 16:38 hours, the Hammer warhead hit the Mirivka Dam with kinetic force equivalent to a 1-ton vehicle slamming a wall at over 3,000 kilometers per hour. The impact generated a pressure wave exceeding 200,000 psi, shattering reinforced concrete that had held back 12 million cubic meters of water. A column of steam, dust, and pulverized stone shot upward to nearly 140 meters, and within moments, the crossing that had carried 300 tons of supplies per night vanished into a widening breach. But that eruption wasn't luck. It was the final move in a minute-by-minute battle in which a single Ukrainian MiG-29 threaded through 6 hostile radar systems while flying lower than 200 meters and burning fuel faster than it could be calculated. Before we dive deeper, if you saw that explosion without context, would you believe one aircraft was responsible? 16:30 hours. A Ukrainian MiG-29 slipped through the pale winter haze above central Donetsk, hugging the river valley at 170 meters, its altimeter barely shifting as the terrain rose and fell beneath it. At 860 kilometers per hour, the jet was covering 238 meters every second, leaving the pilot with zero room for hesitation and even less for error. On his center display, a reconnaissance UAV streamed coordinates updated 12 times per second, marking every truck, crane, and guard post along the Mirivka corridor. What used to be a forgotten maintenance road had transformed into a 37-vehicle supply chain, funneling ammunition and fuel toward the Eastern Front. Russian controllers were pushing nearly 400 tons of cargo through this route every evening. And with more than 60% of the drivers being Ukrainian civilians forced into work, any large weapon strike risked becoming a tragedy. The first disruption came at 16:31:14. A cluster of 7 unarmored Russian trucks attempted to sprint across a narrow auxiliary bridge upstream. The UAV operator reacted instantly. A 1.8 kilogram microcharge, no wider than a coffee mug, dropped cleanly under the lead vehicle. The detonation was subtle, less than 1 kilogram of effective blast energy, but precise enough to buckle the truck's front axle and force the entire line to reverse. Predictably, the Tor M2 station south of the water reacted. In less than 9 seconds, it fired 2 9M331 missiles climbing at nearly 900 meters per second, erasing the UAV feed in a burst of static. Inside the MiG-29, the SPO-15 flickered to life. Slow radar sweeps from an S-400 unit, likely 44 to 46 kilometers east, began brushing across the display. Not enough to lock him, but enough to warn him. The pilot steadied his breathing. These early flashes were nothing more than ripples. The real storm was still waiting beyond the valley's final bend. 16:34 hours. The final bend of the Dnipro Valley appeared on the MiG-29's forward camera. 11 kilometers of rugged earth left before the terrain opened into a flat agricultural plain. Once he crossed that invisible line, the hills that had shielded him for nearly 60 kilometers would offer no more protection. The safe corridor was ending. On the right display, the Buk M3 to the east shifted from wide-angle surveillance to a tighter 3-beam tracking pattern. That change alone told the pilot everything he needed to know. The system had narrowed the search zone from 42 square kilometers to under 6. Someone in a Russian command van was starting to pay attention. Above him, the reconnaissance UAV, which had now been replaced by a secondary unit, reported unexpected activity along the dam's perimeter. 2 ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, each capable of unleashing nearly 4,000 rounds per minute, moved into position overlooking the access road. Those guns weren't meant to stop jets. They were there to protect the civilian truck line. But if they opened fire at the wrong moment, they could disrupt the approach enough to force an abort. Ukraine couldn't allow that. So at 16:34:51, a small strike group of terrain-following drones advanced from the western ridge. Each drone carried a 1.2 kilogram shaped charge, barely enough to peel the armor off a generator box, but perfect for disabling a lookout post. 3 flashes lit up the tree line. The outposts went silent, and Russian operators scrambled to figure out whether this was a diversion or the beginning of something larger. Inside the MiG, the SPO-15 emitted a tighter, quicker pulse rhythm. The S-400's radar sweeps were now arriving every 1.7 seconds, no longer casual, no longer distant. And before we go any further, let me ask you this. If you were in the cockpit and knew the next 8 kilometers were a shooting range, would you continue on or turn back while you still could? The pilot didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttles forward because the real strike, the one the world would talk about, waited just ahead. 1638 hours. The final wall of the valley dropped away, revealing a flat expanse of farmland stretching 8 kilometers to the horizon. The moment the MiG-29 crossed that threshold, its protective terrain mask vanished, and the air around him changed instantly. The SPO-15, quiet seconds earlier, erupted into a cascade of tones as 6 separate emitters locked onto his position. The S-400 to the northeast, the Buk M3 to the east, 2 Tor M2s bracketing the southern tree line, and a pair of early warning radars sweeping from nearly 70 kilometers out, all shifted into full engagement mode. The S-400's gravestone radar fixed on him first, 36 kilometers, well within its low-altitude engagement range. The pulse went from intermittent to continuous in under 0.4 of a second, a transition that meant only one thing: firing geometry achieved. The pilot had no illusions. He had seconds, not minutes. At 16:38:22, he shoved the throttles into full afterburner and pulled the MiG into a near-vertical climb. The twin RD-33s screamed as they forced 84 kilonewtons of thrust through the nozzles, pushing the aircraft from 120 meters to 5,200 meters in 17 seconds. The G-forces crushed his chest, narrowed his vision, and turned his arms into weights, but altitude was the only currency that could buy him a firing margin. Halfway through the climb, the Buk M3 achieved its own narrowband lock. 2 guidance radars now had firing solutions, with a third, Tor M2, closing in. The sky above Donetsk looked empty, but electronically it was a storm of energy converging on one point: his. At the apex of the climb, the pilot inverted, leveled for exactly 1.9 seconds, and watched the weapon system panel turn green across all indicators. GPS, locked on 12 satellites, INS, stable, infrared seeker, cooled to minus 41 degrees Celsius, rocket booster, armed. Everything the bomb needed was ready. He released the hammer at 16:38:41. The moment it separated, its rocket motor fired, propelling it upward to 7,900 meters before it tipped over into a steep descent. The MiG, now suddenly lighter, rolled inverted and dove away at Mach 1.04, slipping beneath the radar's minimum tracking angle. Above him, the hammer acquired the heated concrete of the Mirivka Dam, absorbing 8 hours of solar heat, now 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding water. The bomb adjusted its path by 2.3 degrees, locked onto the thermal signature, and committed to its terminal dive. 6 seconds later, the valley erupted. 1640 hours. The instant the hammer ruptured the Mirivka Dam, the regional air defense grid reacted like a struck nerve. Consoles across a 70-kilometer radius shifted from routine surveillance to emergency engagement as the MiG-29's heat signature flared back into view. Operators who moments earlier monitored wide area scans now faced overlapping alarms demanding immediate action. The first to respond was the S-400 battery northeast of the river. Its launch sequence lasted barely 8 seconds before 2 48N6DM interceptors tore into the air, climbing at nearly 2,000 meters per second. Their seekers needed only a faint plume to guide in. Anything the size of a fighter jet fit well within their detection threshold. Closer to the valley, the Buk M3 fired a 9R-31M, but its radar mistook the hammer's fading thermal wake for the retreating aircraft. The missile veered toward the decoy signature, its guidance correcting every 50 milliseconds until it committed fully to the false trail. At 500 meters, the MiG skimmed the farmland's uneven contours, each hill forcing rapid adjustments. The pilot expelled the remainder of his dual-spectrum chaff over 200 bundles, creating a layered corridor that scattered radar reflections into a wall of distortion. The sky behind him filled with drifting metallic fibers, each fragment reflecting X-band and K-band energy in unpredictable patterns. The Tor M2 south of the river tried to stabilize a fresh track, but its command link updates faltered as the MiG's ECM pod injected false range gates deeper into its display. For 14 long seconds, the pilot became neither a clean target nor a clear miss, only a ghost moving through the noise. The airspace was no longer a battlefield. It was a maze, and he was slipping through its cracks. 1641 hours. The MiG-29 dropped into a shallow network of hills west of the dam, using terrain no taller than 70 to 80 meters to break line of sight from the radars stretching behind him. Each ridge bought him only seconds of cover, but seconds were enough to fracture target locks that had been tightening since the strike. Fuel pressure became the next threat. The gauge steadied at 2,050 kilograms, leaving a window of barely 14 minutes at his current low-altitude burn rate. Any abrupt throttle change would cut that margin further. He held a disciplined 790 kilometers per hour, fast enough to stay unpredictable, but conservative enough to keep the engines from emptying the tanks. Above the hills, the two S-400 missiles widened their search pattern. Their seekers swept arcs more than 16 kilometers across, hunting for a plume that grew colder with each passing second. The MiG's earlier dive had bled off heat rapidly, making him blend into the thermal clutter of the landscape. The Tor M2 tracking him attempted a final precision lock, pulsing updates at 10 times per second, but the MiG's ECM pod fed it a cascade of artificial echoes spaced just far enough apart to mimic a retreating aircraft. For 8 crucial seconds, the system chased a target that didn't exist. Ahead, the terrain following radar sketched a narrow escape lane, 14 kilometers of rising slopes, blind dips, and tight banks. Clearing that corridor meant slipping beyond the densest part of the Russian defense grid. Behind him, radar beams tangled in their own confusion. Ahead, for the first time since the strike, the horizon opened. 1646 hours. The MiG-29 emerged from the last line of hills, its nose pointed toward the western lowlands where the air defense grid thinned into scattered search radars. The cockpit grew noticeably quieter. The SPO-15, which had been screaming under overlapping threats only minutes earlier, now pulsed with wider intervals. 5 seconds, then 7, then nearly 10 between each sweep. The worst of the pursuit had fractured. The pilot checked fuel again. 1,720 kilograms. Enough to get home, but only if he kept his profile clean. A single high G turn could burn through 60 kilograms in seconds. He leveled the MiG at 680 meters, holding a steady 790 kilometers per hour, a speed that balanced fuel conservation with the need to stay unpredictable. Behind him, the S-400 missiles finally reached the limit of their engagement geometry. Their seekers, starved of a stable thermal signature, drifted off course and transitioned into self-destruct mode at roughly 9,000 meters. The Buck M3 radar lost the Hammer's vapor trail completely and returned to wide-area search, unsure whether it had intercepted anything meaningful. And the Tor M2, plagued by corrupted range gates from the MiG's ECM pod, was forced into a full system reset lasting 38 seconds, an eternity in air combat. Far below, the Mirivka Dam continued to deteriorate. Drone footage showed the initial breach expanding from 50-plus meters to nearly 68 meters as water pressure carved deeper into the damaged structure. Supply vehicles that had relied on the crossing were now rerouting along improvised dirt roads, adding 49 kilometers and several hours to their logistics chain. By 1647-12, the MiG crossed into a corridor fully outside Russian engagement envelopes. The sky over Donetsk faded behind him like a door finally closing. The aircraft hadn't just survived, it had rewritten an entire stretch of the front line, using one jet, one strike, and one window of opportunity measured in seconds. When the MiG-29 finally descended toward its forward airstrip, the sun was already sinking behind the western ridge, casting long shadows over a battlefield that had been rewritten in less than 20 minutes. The breach at Mirivka widened with every passing second, reshaping river flow, choking supply routes, and forcing an entire Russian sector to rethink its timetable. One aircraft, one strike, one pilot who understood that seconds, not hours, decide the shape of a war. Operations like this rarely make headlines for long, but their consequences echo across front lines and command maps for weeks. What happened at 1638 wasn't just a successful hit. It was a reminder that precision, timing, and sheer will can outweigh layers of defenses worth hundreds of millions. If you were watching this mission from the ground or from a drone's camera feed, what moment hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments below.